Yes.
Ms. Barlow, were you aware of there having been a practice of home visits being undertaken to assess applications and sometimes photos, for example, being taken of applicants' houses?
Yes, I was aware of that.
And what was your view of that practice?
Well, I became aware that a number of beneficiaries found it quite intrusive, and from a practical point of view, because staff were so few, it was a very labour-intensive way of trying to assess individual grant applications, and we moved away from that practice for those reasons, basically.
Can you recall when it came to an end?
I can't recall exactly, but I'm pretty sure it was phased out during 2013.
The census forms, am I right in understanding that primary beneficiaries, as I think they were now called, so all those who were infected, had to complete a census form every year? Is that right?
They did if they wished to be considered for regular payments from the trust, yeah.
And what was the purpose of requiring that to be done every year?
To assess people's income levels, because the regular payments were basically banded. So depending on people's levels of income, they got a different level of payment from the trust. And so we needed that information each year to assess which band people would fall into.
Could you not have required instead registrants to notify you when there was a change in their circumstances rather than requiring them to complete it on an annual basis?
I think that was a requirement as well, that we asked people to let us know in year if their circumstances would change. But at some point, the board had obviously decided that that was the way in which it wanted to make that annual assessment.
Did you ever suggest to the board changing it so that it became an obligation to notify only when there was a material change of circumstances?
I don't recall us having those discussions.
And is this right? If the census wasn't completed, then the payments would be stopped, or could be stopped at least?
Yes, potentially.
You referred earlier to the trust taking into account welfare benefits. Is this right, that the trust would take into account, for the purposes of assessing means and disposable income, not just the actual benefits received, but also benefits it believed applicants would be eligible for if they applied?
Yes, it was very few cases where that happened, to be fair, but that goes back to that point about the trust not being able to be a substitute for funding that was available elsewhere.
So if a person didn't, for whatever reason, want to apply for a particular welfare benefit, and your understanding, when I say your, I mean the trust's understanding, was that if they applied, they would probably be eligible for it, they would effectively be treated as if they had applied and they had it?
Yes, as I recall.
We touched yesterday when we were looking at the business case and the applications for increased funding from the Department of Health on the taking into account of the Skipton payments. Mm-hmm. So the Skipton payments were, as I understand it, taken into account when calculating household income. Is that your understanding?
They were, and that policy was already in existence when I started.
And the business case we looked at yesterday explained how the trust had some sympathy with beneficiaries' opposition to that, and would like to be able to change its policy, and that's one of the reasons put forward for increased funding.
Yeah.
When the application for increased funding was unsuccessful, did the trust ever consider changing its policy in any event, if necessary, using its reserves to take out of account the Skipton payments?
I don't think so, because I think the trust had calculated that it was kind of unaffordable given the pressures that were already on the budget.
Now, in terms of the income that was taken into account for the purpose of assessing means and deciding if there was disposable income, and therefore if there was or was not need. Is this correct, that the entire household income was taken into account, not just the income of the individual applicant?
It was, yeah.
So if the applicant had a partner or spouse who was employed, for example, or an adult child living in the same household, their income would also fall to be taken into account?
Yes.
Why was that?
Because, as stated previously, the financial support that the trust gave was intended to, if you like, support those in greatest financial need. And clearly overall household income was a factor in that.
So would it be right to say, in effect, that that process penalised those who had partners or spouses or adult children who were in the same household and working from home? They were expected effectively to fund the applicant's needs rather than the trust doing so.
No, I would say what it did was enable the trust to be able to target the money at those who had the greatest financial need.
Were you aware of there being unhappiness amongst beneficiaries that the overall household income was taken into account and not solely the income of the applicant?
Yeah, I was aware that we were aware that there were some people who didn't support that, but equally there were lots of people who kind of provided that information quite readily.
And can we just look at MACF 40.153_028? So this is a report to the Grants Committee in relation to an application for a Motability scooter. I'm not going to ask you about the individual application. If we look towards the bottom of the page, we can see in the penultimate paragraph, just above the figures given at the bottom, it says, however, as the beneficiary is refusing to complete the income and expenditure form, the office is unable to determine charitable need. The committee is therefore asked to make a decision on this request. Yeah. Do we correctly understand from that if the beneficiary declined to complete the income and expenditure form, the application would be declined?
No, what that is saying is that if you remember the document we looked at earlier, which said that this was one of the areas that could be covered under office guidelines. So because the beneficiary didn't want to complete an income and expenditure form, the office didn't have enough information to use its, if you like, devolved authority to actually approve it under office guidelines, and so this was obviously sent on to the committee.
And so could the Grants Committee, in principle, make the grant in the absence of a completed income and expenditure form?
Potentially, but I have no recollection of this case or what happened to it.
If we just go to the next page, again, I'm not asking you about what's been completed or not completed by the individual, but just the general question. This is, I think, an income and expenditure form in use in 2015. And so if we look just down the left-hand side, income, we can see everything being taken into account: MFET payments, MFT payments, skipped and stage 2 payments, net earnings, partners' net earnings. We go down contributions from other household members, and then the various benefits that were taken into account, pensions, and so on. And then if we look at, just to go down to the bottom of the page, we can see towards the bottom, also child benefits also taken into account. And then if we go to the right-hand side, we see expenditure. So the items that were, as it were, allowed, is this correct, for expenditure, were the basic items that we see set out here: mortgage, rent, council tax. We've then got utilities, TV, telephone, groceries, so food, and then insurances, clothes, personal items, travel, bank charges, loans, credit cards, and then there's a provision for other. How was there any guidance either to office staff or to the committee or to applicants as to what would be acceptable under other?
Well, I guess it was any other items that people had regular expenditure for that wasn't listed above. So that was for people to tell us what those things were.
So is this right then in terms of the process? The office staff or the grants committee would essentially see the total of all of the income, including partners and other household and the benefits we see set out there. They would see what that total was. They would then identify what was spent on the items we see listed, which are the basic necessities, as it were. And then whatever was left, leaving aside what might or might not fall under the category of other, was regarded as disposable income.
Correct.
And then it was then down to the judgment of the office staff or the grants committee as to whether what was being sought should be met out of that disposable income.
Essentially, yeah.
Was this a form that had to be completed even by those who were in receipt of regular top-up payments and whose financial status you'd therefore already be familiar with?
We didn't ask for the expenditure information for the regular payments.
We can take that down, thank you. In terms of the position of widows and or partners and other dependents, I'm not going to ask you to go through the detail of exactly what was potentially available financially at any one time, and we're conscious it changed over the years. But in your view, was the funding provided to widows and to the bereaved community ever sufficient?
Well, the bereaved partners and spouses, there was, as we discussed yesterday, there was a regular payment system for those people, which was structured differently from the regular payments for the infected community, because the bereaved partners and spouses didn't have any other income, for example, the MFET or the Skipton Stage 2 payments. And so the regular payments for the sort of beneficiaries who were widows or sort of bereaved partners and spouses, those were, I think, reasonably generous in terms of what the trust could afford. I can't recall, as I recall, for grants, the same criteria applied to the bereaved partners and spouses as for primary beneficiaries, although there would have been things that didn't apply, sort of like mobility potentially, because the bereaved partners and spouses didn't have haemophilia or any disabilities. But essentially those, it was a kind of a similar a support as possible. But as I say, without the fact that the bereaved didn't receive the regular payments through MFET or Skipton.
And you uncovered, I think in 2013 when you arrived, significant failings in the way in which regular pay had been made to widows. Is that right?
No, it wasn't failings. It was the fact that one of these annual censuses that had been carried out for widows hadn't been implemented. And so there were payments outstanding to people.
So if we just perhaps look at the document in question, it's MACF 5024_044. The phrase significant failings, Ms. Barlow, was your phrase in the report you prepared at the time. So report to the Board of Trustees from the Chief Executive, 29th of April 2013. The purpose of this report is to advise trustees of significant failings which the Chief Executive has uncovered in relation to the way staff have been making regular payments to MFT beneficiaries, in particular to widows. And then you set out details of a review, the implications and proposed actions, which were then, I think, considered by the board at the next meeting. Bearing in mind your own description of significant failings, how had this come about?
Well, I wasn't there at the time, obviously. This was just something I found. But essentially, as I said, it was a census, an annual census, that had been, if you like, the forms had been sent out and the information submitted back to the trust, but the census had never been implemented. So that was, it was a management failing an organisation failing in that the staff hadn't completed the work.
And I think if we go towards, we can see that from the bottom of the screen, it emerged that this census from the autumn of 2011 was never processed or implemented. If we go on to the next page, I think we can see some other areas of error. So widows, this is the first bullet points in bold print. Widows whom we were paying prior to the 1st of April 2012 have not had their top-up payments increased to take into account the new benchmark. Then the next paragraph says to compound all this, some of the calculations have been done incorrectly. Next paragraph is about council tax payments not having always been taken into account, so some having been underpaid. Different versions of a spreadsheet, which means that some people have been paid the incorrect monthly amounts because staff have been using the wrong figures. Now you, I think, set out a number of steps to address that. And is it right, was your understanding that the steps that you recommended, they were largely accepted by the board?
Yes, that's my recollection. And we did a discrete piece of work to actually kind of go back and sort all this out.
Were steps taken to ensure that problems like this did not recur?
They were, and in some ways that was also part of the, if you like, the staff restructuring that occurred.
Were those who were affected by these failings written to have explained to them what had gone wrong and offered an apology, as far as you can recall?
I can't recall. They were certainly written to explain, I think, what had happened and what was happening with their payments. And obviously some people received, quite large back payments.
We can take that down. Thank you, Seamus. In relation to children, so the adult children who had lost parents to HIV, or indeed to HCV, so the children of those who would have been primary beneficiaries. Is this right that at the point in time at which that child reached 18 or completed tertiary education, there was no longer any form of support, financial support or assistance, which reflected their position or was available to them?
Yeah, as I recall.
Was the possibility of extending support to children in that position ever considered by the board or by you, as far as you can recall?
As I recall, not during my time with the trust.
And then can you recall whether any efforts were made, either to your knowledge before you arrived or after you arrived, to seek out widows or children or other family members who might have lost touch with the Macfarlane Trust and who might not, for example, know about the post-Archer reforms?
I seem to think a piece of work had been done, if you like, which led to this widow census that wasn't completed. But that was before, well, the widow census that wasn't implemented, should I say, but that was before my time.
Just want to ask you a couple of questions about loans. If we go to MACF 5027_165, Sorry, Shemik, I've written that down wrong. It's MACF 5027_155. My apologies. This is a report from you, January 2017, about remaining loans and advances made to beneficiaries. If we could go to the to the second page, bottom half of the page. You'll see listed underneath the table a number of different types of loans. So we have member advances, property equity loans, secured loans, secured by legal charge attracting interest loans, unsecured loans, and then loans attracting interest, so unsecured loans attracting interest. So a range of different loans. Was there, to your knowledge, in any of the years that you were at the Macfarlane Trust, ever any policy or criteria or guidance which mapped out what type of loan might be made available of these various kinds and in what circumstances?
Well, as set out in my written statements, my recollection is that loans weren't made during my time at the Trust, and the only thing that was made were the member advances, which was where people effectively got a lump sum advance from their regular monthly payments and then didn't receive their monthly payments for a period of time until that money was effectively equalled out.
So is this right? Because these loans that we're discussing here, with the exception of member advances, weren't made during your time. Is this right? You don't know how it was decided by the Macfarlane Trust that a loan might take the form of being secured or unsecured, attracting interest or not, and so on?
No, I'm afraid I don't, because that was all done sort of many years previously.
Was there any policy or criteria or guidance during your time which set out the circumstances in which such loans might be written off or by contrast might be enforced?
No, neither. I mean, I was aware that, during my tenure, a number of loans were just repaid. But no, there was, as I say, this was apart from the member advances, this was largely a sort of an historic position.
Can you recall whether your tenure there were any loans that were cancelled or amended so that there was no repayment required or a reduced repayment required?
The only thing I recall, but I'm struggling to remember the timing, was I think that we had one unsecured loan, which is I think the 8,300 there, where the conditions of repayment was so kind of vague as to be difficult to enforce, and so when the Trust was having discussions about what the position was when it was going to wind up, I think the board agreed that loan had to be written off for those reasons. But otherwise, I just remember a number of loans being repaid during my time there.
Okay, thanks. We can take that down, Shemik. I want to ask you next about your relationship with beneficiaries. This is at the Macfarlane Trust. I'm going to come shortly to a number of the same issues in relation to Caxton. When you took up your post as chief executive, did you regard it as important to establish a good relationship with beneficiaries?
Yeah, within the context of what the organisation did.
And how did you go about that?
Well, I'd understood that the partnership group was the main vehicle for communicating in general terms with beneficiaries.
So I'll come on to the partnership group in a moment, but leaving aside the partnership group, did you take any steps to meet with beneficiaries?
No, not on a one-to-one basis per se. I mean, I met with some of the beneficiary trustees and some, I think I said yesterday, I had meetings with the beneficiary who was going to be the new chair of the partnership group.
Did you hold or arrange for there to be any regular meetings not on a one-to-one basis, but with you'd travel to Birmingham or you'd travel to Cardiff or wherever, and beneficiaries could come and meet with you or with your staff at those meetings to build up a relationship or air concerns?
Not that I recall. As I say, I'd been led to understand that the partnership group was the kind of the main vehicle for doing that.
I'm going to ask you later, probably this afternoon, about relations with the Haemophilia Society, but did you or your staff make any attempts to build a relationship with other representative organisations such as Haemophilia Wales or Haemophilia Scotland?
I don't recall the detail, I'm afraid.
In terms of the partnership group, it's right, isn't it, that a few months after you arrived, I can check the date, but I think it may be the October or thereabouts of 2013, and the partnership group indicated it no longer wanted to have meetings, or that there was some form of breakdown of the relationship?
Yeah, and my understanding from, I guess, talking to colleagues when I joined was that had been a pattern with the partnership group for Macfarlane, that it had been beneficiary-led and chaired by a beneficiary, and that it went through various, if you like, incarnations, and then something went wrong and it folded for a while, and then someone else started it up. And at the point at which I joined, someone had, if you like, come forward to become the chair again. And as I recall, there were 2 meetings of the group during my tenure. And then again, as I recall, the new chairman failed or couldn't get agreement with the beneficiary attendees at the second meeting about the minutes. And I think in the end, as I understand it, just decided that he didn't want to continue being the chair of the group, and so it kind of it sort of folded at that point.
So if the partnership group was no longer a means of being the main channel of communication or relationship with beneficiaries, what, if anything, was done to forge relationships with the beneficiary community beyond the partnership group?
Well, I think it's important to remember that we were communicating with individual beneficiaries all the time, because our main role was providing support to those individuals. So in that sense, that was an ongoing relationship with those individual people who were getting support from us. And in terms of the day-to-day work, in many ways, not much changed from year to year. That the provision of support that was there when I started, was pretty historically embedded in the organisation, and that's what continued. And so we would communicate with everyone when there were essentially things to communicate about. So, for example, when we ran the reserves grants programme in, I think it was in the autumn of 2013, then something like that, we would just write individually to all beneficiaries to communicate about what we were doing. And then in addition to that, we'd use the website as a vehicle for putting information up that people might need to know. But essentially, a lot of the time, we wrote to people individually.
Do you think relationships with the beneficiary and community might have been improved if steps had been taken to organise regular meetings, perhaps in different parts of the UK from time to time?
But I think I would say that on the whole, relationships with beneficiaries were good. And I think I said yesterday, some of the staff at Alliance House had been working there for a long period of time. And so there were, individual relationships with the people who, if you like, were the sort of frontline staff to communicate with beneficiaries, were very good. But there was obviously a minority of people who, if you like, wished the trust had perhaps a broader role, and could provide more money than it was able to, who were dissatisfied with what the trust did. But some of that was outside of, a lot of that was outside of our control, really.
How do you know it was a minority of people, or a small minority? I think you're a minority of people. It was
Yeah,
the words
I
you
think
used.
just because of, the conversations that used to go on individually between people, between beneficiaries and staff. So that was the impression that we had.
What steps were taken to facilitate interaction, communication, relationships, friendships between beneficiaries? There had been, I think, previously weekend events and other events, some of which at least then fell away or were cancelled. What was your attitude to the Trust arranging and funding such events during your tenure?
Well, some of it was an affordability issue, really. Well, a lot of it was an affordability issue. But those events, as I was led to understand or seen the sort of the figures for, they were quite expensive for a sort of a small number of people to attend. And so, again, it was felt that if we had to sort of try and make best use of the money, that wasn't necessarily the best way of using it because it was benefiting a relatively small number of people.
If there had not been the financial constraints you described, do you consider it would have been a good idea to be able to continue with such events?
Yeah, I'm sure they would have continued if there hadn't been those constraints.
And then there came a point, I think, during your tenure when a decision was taken to close down the bulletin board, which was a means of communication between beneficiaries. Was that your decision?
It was a board decision.
Was it a decision you agreed with?
It was because we became aware that it was a bulletin board that was essentially being run in Macfarlane's name, but a beneficiary had always moderated it, and we were aware that it was being used as a means of beneficiaries being able to be hostile to each other, and legally, I mean, as I said before, the trust had a duty of care both to its beneficiaries and to its staff, and we needed to make sure that we weren't, if you like, supporting a vehicle where people were abusing each other, that we had no control over, but it was being done in our name essentially. But the beneficiaries then moved to set up their own, and we facilitated that by there was a mechanism where we effectively ratified whether someone was eligible to join that new board.
Prior to the decision to close down the bulletin board, had consideration been given to steps falling short of closing it down that might have addressed the concerns you say led to the decision?
I can't recall now, but all I recall is that there'd been a very strong, if you like, cultural preference from the beneficiaries that that the trust shouldn't know what was going on that bulletin board, and therefore that was why a beneficiary was mediating it, as I'd understood.
Now, my next questions relate to both Macfarlane and Caxton, and they concern dealings with the DWP, the Department for Work and Pensions. Did you yourself have any dealings with or meetings with the DWP during your tenure as Chief Executive of either organisation?
I think I had one meeting, and I'm afraid I can't remember what we discussed. I can't remember what the meeting was about.
Did you become aware of beneficiaries of Macfarlane and or Caxton having difficulties with the DWP and being involved in benefits and fraud investigations?
Yes, we were aware that happened occasionally, and that's why we used a specialist benefits advisor who could support people that were going through that process. But I have to say that most of those cases, they arose, if you like, through the actions of individual, if you like, DWP officers around and about the country. It wasn't if you like, a DWP sort of HQ type issue. It was where people locally in DWP offices didn't understand that the payments that people received from the Alliance House organisations were meant to be disregarded for benefits.
Did you ever raise at a senior level, so Chief Executive to your equivalent or thereabouts in the DWP, concerns about the fact that this was happening in different areas across the country, and ask for steps to be taken?
A letter had been devised. I think it was done jointly with Alliance House and DWP before I started, which sort of set out very clearly what the disregards of the payments. And I know that our benefits advisor always took these issues up, but it wasn't huge numbers, as I recall.
Okay, so is the answer to my question, you yourself didn't take this up with the DWP?
No.
Okay,
No.
We can no doubt ask Mr. Bateman further about that.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any beneficiaries of either Macfarlane or Caxton who were either prosecuted or required to pay money back to the DWP?
Not that I recall.
I want to come on to ask you in a little more detail now about the Caxton Foundation. Your statement in the documents that we've seen identify a number of committees of the Caxton Foundation. There's an audit committee and an employment committee, and then the National Welfare Committee. Was that the equivalent of the NSSC/Grants Committee of the Macfarlane Trust?
It was, yeah, that's correct.
And there was also an MFT Caxton Foundation Liaison Committee. What was that? The role of that organisation?
I think that committee had been established when Caxton was being set up and then introduced. As I think I described yesterday, that the staff had previously been employed by the Macfarlane Trust, and that the Macfarlane Trust had previously been the leaseholder for the office building. And when Caxton was introduced, a decision had been made to shift responsibility for those things to Caxton. And my understanding was that that committee had been used in the early days as a way of, if you like, Macfarlane continuing to understand what was happening in relation to the staff and premises.
I want to ask you about user trustees next for Caxton Foundation and contrast the position with the Macfarlane Trust. I'm going to do so without identifying or referring to anyone by name, and will invite you to answer likewise. The Macfarlane Trust had from time to time over a number of years had trustees with experience of HIV, either directly or through family connections. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Now, the Caxton Foundation appears to have set its face against that at an early stage. And I want to ask you to look with me at a document from January 2013, so around the time you arrived.
Yeah.
It's CAXT 40109_122, please, Shomik. So if we go, if we can just zoom in on the bottom of the page under the heading, "Are beneficiary trustees useful?" please, Shomik. Thank you. We just scroll down a bit further. So can we just zoom in on those last three paragraphs? Perfect. Thank you. Ms. Barlow, so you know that this is from a paper authored by Mr. Stevens and Mr. Lister, from whom the inquiry will be hearing over the coming weeks. 25th of January 2013, he says clearly there's a prima facie appeal to having beneficiaries' views available directly to the board. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and that's very commonplace in charities.
Which I think indeed is the point made in the next paragraph. Then he says, or they say, bottom paragraph, a problem with appointing beneficiary trustees to Caxton is the absence of a neutral outside body with rights of appointment, which means that beneficiary volunteers for the board would most likely come from activist groups.
Mm-hmm.
Did you understand the reference to activist groups, what that meant?
I assume it meant the campaign groups.
And then such people are likely to have difficulty with the requirement that they should not, over the page, represent anybody or any cause outside the charity, but should at all times and only act in the best interest of the charity itself, not of its beneficiaries, nor of any outside interest such as a campaign group. They might also find it difficult to accept that anything trustees learn about the charity should be confidential. Did you agree that such people, that's the phrase in this paper, so those who belong to activist or campaign groups, were likely to have difficulty in acting at all times and only in the best interest of the charity rather than external campaigning?
I don't recall my reaction to the paper at the time, but I think it's correct that trustees do have to act in the best interest of the charity, and they do have to kind of not benefit personally from being a trustee. And clearly it would there would be potential conflicts of interest, particularly, I guess, for campaigners who whose aims might conflict with those of the charities. But having said that, I'm not sure you're aware, but the Caxton Foundation did actually go on to appoint a user trustee, who actually happened not to be someone from a campaign group. But I think the main point is that if you do have user trustees in the charity, and you have to take measures to avoid conflicts of interest.
Would you accept that there can be, and indeed there had been, I think, at the Macfarlane Trust, measures taken which would involve or could involve not participating in certain committees and obviously not being involved on any decisions on applications made by that individual or their family? It wasn't necessary to exclude user trustees altogether, was it, to avoid a conflict of interest?
No, but we didn't go, and Caxton didn't, went on not to exclude user trustees. It went on to have a user trustee.
But only the one, is that right?
Only the one. And
then we see in the next paragraph, it said this.
Just before we do that, what is said in the second line is that the user trustee should at all times and only act in the best interest of the charity itself. And then this, not of its beneficiaries. This charity existed solely to serve the best interests of its beneficiaries, did it not? Within the terms, within the scope of its funds available to do so.
Sorry, whereabouts are we looking?
Second line.
Yeah, I wouldn't agree with that statement. That's correct, that the trustees are there to act in the best interest of the charity, including what it can do for its beneficiaries. But I would agree that it's not there to act in the interests of outside organisations such as particular campaign groups.
No, it was just the reference to not of its beneficiaries, when that is the whole object of the charity, one might have thought.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
And then if we look at the next paragraph, it says this: a minor point is that the DH would not wish the Secretary of State to be asked to approve the appointment as trustee of somebody whose main activity is campaigning against government policy. It would also appear that we were supporting or at least sympathising with the campaigners. Did you agree at the time, or if you can't recall your views at the time, do you agree now with what's said in that paragraph?
I don't know. I have no idea what the Department of Health's view would have been about appointing someone who was a campaigner to the board.
It would appear from the second sentence of that paragraph that these two trustees of the Caxton Foundation didn't want the foundation to be giving an appearance even of sympathising with campaigners. Was it your view as Chief Executive that the Caxton Foundation should not give an appearance even of sympathy, let alone support for campaigners?
I think one of the difficulties were that, I'm sure you're aware of this yourself, there were very many campaign groups within like the contaminated blood area. and our experiences with those campaigns groups didn't always agree with each other. And so, I don't know. I don't know how many different members of campaign groups we would have had to have had on the board for people to have been happy that someone wasn't being left out.
That's a slightly different point with respect, Ms.
And
Barlow.
that's how we actually ended up with the partnership group, where we did have representatives of all the campaign groups on it. But I'm not sure there would have been enough board spaces to accommodate everyone.
But it's a slightly different point from the question I asked, which is, and obviously I will ask Mr. Lister about this, or we will ask Mr. Lister about this in due course, but it would appear from that paragraph that there was a concern that the foundation, the Caxton Foundation, should not appear to be even sympathising with campaigners, not because of differences between different campaign groups, but because the foundation shouldn't appear to be sympathetic to something that is contrary to government policy. As chief executive, was that your view, that there should be no appearance of from the foundation of being against government policy?
No, I mean, this goes back to the point we've discussed in other areas, that I think having a campaigner on the board would have been problematic in terms of the conflict of interest issue. But I mean, this was the first meeting that I obviously attended the Caxton Foundation board, and I don't recall that view being something that we discussed subsequently, or that was a big issue particularly. I think it was more of the point of it was the conflict of interest that was the bigger issue.
Could we next look then at AHOH 5053, please? So this is a letter from the 12th of May 2014. It's from Anne Lloyd, who was then chair of the Caxton Foundation, to the Under-Secretary of State for Public Health, Jane Ellison MP. It says, I'm writing to update you on the progress achieved by the Caxton Foundation over the past 12 months. I was clear when I met your predecessor that at that time, whilst I and the CEO had been in post for only 2 and 3 months respectively, the organisation was not working effectively. Our concerns at the time were, 1, to improve governance of the organisation, to develop a vision and strategy, review the administrative processes and competence and capability of the staff. 2, to improve communications with our beneficiaries and to improve their understanding of our ability to assist them. 3, to understand better the needs of our beneficiaries. So it would appear from this that at a relatively early stage during your tenure, according to this, perhaps only some 3 months after you'd been appointed, it had become apparent to you and the chair that the Caxton Foundation wasn't working effectively in the respects they're identified. Is that right? And what can you recall about your concerns as to the way in which the Caxton Foundation was operating?
Well, I mean, in the sort of on a day-to-day basis, it was similar issues to the ones that we were experiencing at Macfarlane, in terms of grant applications were taking a long time to be processed. And I mean, essentially, when Caxton was introduced, as I understood it, there'd just been one additional staff member who'd been brought onto the team to deal with the daily administration, and things hadn't been looked at in the round. So again, that was one of the reasons we did the sort of the staffing review and the restructuring of the welfare team.
And what was done in response to concerns number 2 and 3? So the need to improve communications with beneficiaries, to improve their understanding of the Caxton's ability to assist them, and to understand better the needs of beneficiaries.
Yeah, well, with regard to those, that was when we set up the partnership group for Caxton, which I mean, I would say for Caxton as well as Macfarlane, there was regular communication with very many beneficiaries on a daily basis, because of the fact that they were approaching the organisation for support. But the partnership group was kind of used as a way of talking about, if you like, some of the more overarching issues. And in terms of the needs of the beneficiaries, the Welfare Committee, the National Welfare Committee, if you like, played quite a role in that, because through the applications that came through to the committee could essentially see what people were requesting and what some of the situations of people were. And as I've referred to in some of my written statements, that led to the development of the regular payment scheme for Caxton beneficiaries, because through the committee it was obvious that there were lots of people who were on low incomes who were needing regular support from the foundation.
If we just go on to CAXT 40109_115. This is an undated document, although it may be from the reference in the top right-hand corner that it's a document from 2013, because that we may be able to trace that through to the minutes for 2013. But we can see paragraph 2. It talks about a strategy. It's headed "Issues raised by beneficiaries." Paragraph 2: key challenges that there's no beneficiary community as such. Comment on Caxton therefore comes from campaigners whose primary focus is to secure what they see as a fairer deal from the government. And then at 3, to date, Caxton's not entered into formal dialogue with beneficiaries about the type of services we deliver and how we deliver them, apart from occasional responses to issues raised by individual campaigners. This lack of active engagement means that the focus remains on the negative, placing us in a defensive position. The Caxton board also appears aloof and out of touch. I don't know whether this was a document authored by you or not, Ms. Barlow. Are you able to assist?
No, no, it's not. I don't think at all.
Is it a document you recall seeing at the time?
It actually isn't.
Okay, well, do
you... It refers to a meeting on the 29th of November, which I think that must have been 29th of November 2012.
Do you recognise or agree with the description that we see in paragraph 3 of the Caxton board appearing aloof and out of touch? Was that your impression?
No, I wouldn't have said that they were.
Okay. If we then go on to the next page, and if we turn it around so that we can see it. Now, there are a number of specific issues that had apparently been raised with the minister. I'm not going to ask you what was raised with the minister because it may have been at a meeting that you weren't at. I don't know, but it's more the themes that I want to ask you about and what was done about it. So if we see point 2, Caxton forms are excessively long and unnecessarily complicated. And then the comment section records the minister being unimpressed and the census form being modelled on one used by the Macfarlane Trust, the suggestion of reviewing it. What, if anything, do you recall being done once you took over in January 2013 about the Caxton forms to address this concern?
I don't recall what happened with the paperwork, I'm afraid.
Point 3 then is the burden of justifying charitable need to receive support is undermining and leaves claimants feeling like undignified beggars. And then we see the comment is that the minister told campaigners nothing could be done about the fact that Caxton is a charity. But then the comment is, in developing our strategy and improving the way we communicate what we offer to beneficiaries, we should consider how we encourage people to feel less uncomfortable about applying to us for support. What, if anything, was done to try and address that feeling people had of being like undignified beggars, of being uncomfortable in asking for assistance?
Yeah, I can't work out whether are these notes from the CBC's meeting with the minister, or are they meant to be a meeting that Caxton had?
It's a document that's come to us from the Caxton Foundation. I can't tell you its author.
No, okay.
But the "we" appears to, in the comments, appear to be we, the Caxton Foundation.
I mean, I think it was sort of said in my written statements that this was an ongoing source of tension with some beneficiaries, that they were extremely uncomfortable and unhappy with the fact that they had to apply to a charity for financial support. Now, we we were a charity. We couldn't, as this line says, there's nothing that could be done about the fact that Caxton was a charity. But in similar sort of vein to what we did for Macfarlane, it was about trying to make things as clear and straightforward as possible so that people knew what they had to send when they were applying, that they weren't forced to go through hoops that took months, and that it was, it should be a reasonably straightforward process once people knew what they needed to provide in order to apply. And that we had systems in place to deal with those applications reasonably quickly.
Okay, well, we may come back to some of those issues. If we just look at 4, there's no support for ongoing need. Now, that's the absence at that point in time of any regular payment scheme. I want to come on to that. But I just want to ask you about the last sentence of the comment there. There is a strong argument that we should focus our resources on encouraging greater independence rather than the reverse. Now, the theme of avoiding dependency emerges in other Caxton documents. I don't want to take you to all of them, but why was there a concern about encouraging dependency?
I mean, my recollection is that was something that was kind of a theme early on, but the reality was that some people were in a really difficult financial situation. But certainly my recollection is that with the development of the regular payment system, that was partly to enable people to have more control over, if you like, their own finances, instead of having to come to the National Welfare Committee time and time again to ask for small amounts of money for small grants.
If we could then look at a partnership group meeting, so that's CAXT 40110_048. And we can see notes of a meeting of the Caxton Foundation Partnership Group held on the 11th of June 2013. And you were present. There were also a number of those present representing campaigns or campaign groups. Was this, as far as you can recall, the first time you had met representatives of campaign groups relevant to the Caxton Foundation's work?
As I recall, I think this must have been the first meeting of the partnership group.
And is this right? You hadn't taken any steps to meet with campaign representatives prior to that?
No, I think Caxton had met with them, but I don't think I had in the time that I'd been there prior to this.
If we go to the bottom of the page, we can see there's an aim for the partnership group to be inclusive, to include primary beneficiaries, widows and carers. And then after discussion, it was agreed that the main partnership group should meet twice a year. Was that sufficient, do you think, in order to for the Caxton Foundation to establish an ongoing relationship with beneficiaries?
Well, as I said, a lot of the work of the organisation didn't change very much from week to week, month to month. So probably in terms of talking about sort of developments, then probably it was adequate.
And then if we just go on to the next page, top of the next page, was also agreed that there should be a wider forum to which all beneficiaries could be invited. This could be convened once a year. Did that in fact happen?
No, but we did, as I recall, we did a sort of a survey amongst the beneficiary community as to what events they would like. Could you just possibly just show me the previous page again?
Yes,
just so
of
that
course.
I can see
if we go to the bottom of the previous page.
Attendees were. Okay. Yeah, because later on we slightly changed the partnership group because, as you'll see from the sort of the attendance list for this meeting, it was primarily campaigners, and we were aware that there were a lot of beneficiaries who weren't involved in campaign groups, and who told us they didn't feel represented by the campaign groups. So we ended up actually broadening the membership of the group so that we had beneficiaries who weren't campaigners involved. And as part of that process, we kind of we did a survey to basically ask who, if people were interested in becoming part of the partnership group. We also, I think, as I recall, asked questions like, did people want to attend regional events? And there wasn't much support for that. And as I recall, there wasn't much support for having a sort of, did it say a national event or an annual event?
Yes, and a wider forum once a year.
Yeah, so as I say, we explored that later on when we broadened the group, and there wasn't much support for it.
We go to the third page, please, Shomek. Under the heading means testing, so the second main paragraph on the page, we can see that there had been a £14,000 poverty threshold. And then it says, when JB started as chief executive, she'd questioned why Caxton needed detailed financial information from everyone if payments such as the winter fuel payment were not means tested. Caxton would therefore be moving away from asking for detailed financial information in terms of an annual census, although it would continue to request income and expenditure information in relation to grant applications. Now, first of all, in relation to the grant applications, was the information that was requested for Caxton applicants the same or broadly similar to the information that was requested from Macfarlane Trust applicants that we looked at a little while ago?
Yeah.
And this would appear to suggest that Caxton was going to abandon the annual census. Is that what in fact happened?
It did, until it introduced a regular payment system, because essentially what was happening is that an annual census was being done, but it wasn't being used for anything.
Okay. So it was reintroduced at the point in time at which the Reg Pay scheme was first.
Yeah, it was introduced for people that wanted to apply to receive a payment under the regular payment scheme, but to gather that information when we weren't using it, it was completely unnecessary at that stage, and that's the point about the winter fuel payment, that if we were means testing the winter fuel payment, then there would have been a point in having an annual census and understanding people's if you like income brackets. But because we weren't doing that at this particular point in time, we didn't need to have that annual census.
Okay. And then if we go back to the main page and look under the heading Office Guidelines, if we can just see that paragraph, Shomek. It's recorded there that someone in the group asked whether the current office guidelines could be published on the website. CL said it would not be appropriate to do this, as the office guidelines only related to those things which the staff team could authorise without reference to the NWC, so that's the National Welfare Committee, and they would therefore be misleading. However, consideration could be given to outlining the types of support that could be given. So is this right, that at this point in time, which is June 2013, there was nothing available to beneficiaries in terms of guidelines or information about the support that they could apply for?
I can't remember the exact time. I know when I started, there was a sort of a little booklet had been developed, which I think set out some of the support that was available. That had been done in the beginning. And I mean, we went on to talk in a lot more detail about what was available through the website, and I think we had written information that was also sent out to applicants. I can't remember the exact timings of when that happened, unfortunately.
Same question, Ms. Barlow, as in relation to the Macfarlane Trust. Why not simply publish the office guidelines with an appropriate explanation that the amounts in there were only maximums in terms of what the staff could authorise, so that everybody could see what they could apply for and how the process would be implemented?
Yeah, well, as I say, all I can say is what did happen, and that was the board decision, that there was a concern that it would be misleading, because the guidelines were just guidelines, and that if someone couldn't get something approved through the office guidelines and the delegated authority, that the application could still go to NWC.
Now, I wanted to ask you next about the process of identifying beneficiaries for the Caxton Foundation. We can look at the documents if need be, but I'm going to try and take the figures without looking at the documents, and we can look at them if you want to. At your first meeting of trustees, the issue was raised about the need to try and identify more beneficiaries because fewer had registered with the Caxton Foundation than expected. And you raised the possibility of getting coverage in medical and national press. Was that in fact done, as far as you can recall?
No, and it kind of got superseded, really, because essentially someone had to have received a payment from the Skipton Fund in order to be eligible for or to receive support from the Caxton Foundation. So that kind of eligibility fed straight back to the Skipton Fund. And I think there were various discussions within the Department of Health as to, the most obvious way of identifying more Caxton Foundation beneficiaries was to go back through the people that received payments from the Skipton Fund. And ultimately, that is what happened, because the department commissioned a look-back exercise. I think it was in 2014, and Skipton contacted everyone who'd, I think, had a Skipton Stage 1 payment. And through that process, it identified sort of a new number of Caxton beneficiaries, and as you'll be aware, the number of beneficiaries increased kind of 50-60% at that point. But that was the most direct way of doing it, really, because only people that had received a Skipton Fund payment would be eligible to be Caxton Foundation beneficiaries, and so the most direct way of identifying those people was by going back through the Skipton Fund records.
Did you gain any understanding of why it took some 3 years or so from the Caxton's establishment prior to your appointment in 2011 for this exercise to be undertaken in 2014?
No, I don't know.
And can you recall if any steps were taken by Caxton itself to try and ensure potential beneficiaries were aware of its existence in the years 2013-14 prior to the exercise you've described?
Well, one of the things that was done was that when people received a Skipton payment, they were told about Caxton. And I can't remember whether in the beginning, before I started, whether that was actually happening. But certainly that became, if you like, a very sort of embedded way of making sure that people that received a Skipton Fund payment were being fed through to the option of becoming a Caxton beneficiary.
Now, in terms of the figures, without going to the documents, the annual report for the year ending March 2013 describes 555 primary beneficiaries and widows registered with the Caxton Foundation, and records it was lower than expected. The annual report for the following year, March 2014, shows an increase to 695. And then the annual report for March 2015 shows a much steeper rise to 1,080 registered. Is this correct, that I think near doubling of the number of beneficiaries in a 2-year period did not result in any additional funding from the Department of Health?
No, it didn't.
How did you and the Board of Trustees of the Caxton Foundation respond to to that, the refusal of the Department of Health to increase your allocation at all? What was the reaction?
I mean, I recall that the big jump was obviously from March 14 to March 15, and that was due to this skip to look back exercise that happened at some point. I think it was in the sort of the summer of 2014. And I'm sure you're already aware of this, and I think it's been referred to in my written statements, that Caxton used to make a winter fuel payment. And obviously it was, at the start of the year, we'd budget for the different aspects of the work. And we were really concerned that because we didn't know at what point that the increase in beneficiaries would stop. We had no idea. It kind of went crazy for several months with more and more people coming online. And so the board had to take the decision to stagger the winter fuel payment in 2014-15. And I think we paid probably 350 in sort of November time, because we weren't sure whether we could afford the full 500, because we weren't sure when this sort of additional stream of beneficiaries would come online, or when it would stop. And at that point, we did write to the department saying that we felt we needed extra money to cope with this, and that we were having to defer part of the winter fuel payment, but no additional funding was forthcoming.
And last question before we break, I think, is this also right that the consequence of the increase in the number of beneficiaries and the absence of any increase, let alone a commensurate increase in the amount of funding, also affected the Caxton Foundation's ability to implement its regular payment scheme?
Yes, I mean it did. I mean we had been hoping to make a higher level of regular payments to people who would have been eligible, but the department, I'm sure you will have seen the letter. I think the phrase used was "it's not the right time" or something like that, and so they didn't fund that business case either. But because through what we were seeing at the National Welfare Committee, we were very aware that there were people who were on low incomes and who needed additional support. So we had to kind of go back and recalculate the figures that we'd originally developed, so that we could implement a sort of a lower level of payments, but still give people some kind of support.
Well, we'll look at a couple of those documents, but perhaps at 2:00, sir.
Yes, so we'll take a break now until 2:00. The usual rules, of course, apply. See you back at 2. Thank you very much.